Now here's an interesting little device. This is the Stereocast from Sanyo. This came out around about 50 years ago and it allowed you to listen to FM radio in stereo. Nothing too exciting about that, you might think. After all, there's plenty of portable FM stereo radios around. Well, yeah, this isn't the radio. No, this is just a part of it. The rest of it, that's in here. Let me explain. When I featured this portable music system a few weeks ago, there was one thing I got wrong about it. I assumed these sockets on the front here that are labelled up as stereo out were a standard line level stereo output for the whole system. They're not. In fact, it's a mono output and it's just for the radio, and it's only there to attach up to this Stereocast adapter. When I made that video, I made a point of mentioning that the radio seemed to pick up a particularly good signal, and it turns out now there was a good reason for that. This is just a mono FM radio, something I didn't spot at the time because frankly I just wasn't expecting it. I mean, it's just a music centre in a case, stereo record player, stereo cassette deck, stereo speakers, stereo mic inputs. You'd naturally assume stereo FM radio, but you'd be wrong to do that because it's just a mono FM radio, and that explains why the reception is so much better, but more on that in a moment. This control at the top, that's the volume. It controls the volume of the output here, which is a 1/4" headphone jack in stereo. The rest of it, well, we've just got a wire going into the top with this dual plug on here, and there's a little LED there that indicates when the signal that's being received is in stereo. And it just plugs into the front of the case here. This one receives power, that one is the audio, and if you look at them you'll notice it's picking up mono audio and making that into stereo. So we'll just pop that into here, we'll turn it on. So I'm going to use my right hand here to go through the tuning dial. Keep an eye on the front of the device, you'll see the red light comes on whenever I tune into a station that's broadcasting a stereo signal. So if you bought yourself one of these and you fancied listening to the FM radio in stereo, which I don't think is an unreasonable request, well, you also had to go ahead and buy yourself one of these. Now, there were two varieties of this Stereocast adapter. There was one with a permanently attached set of headphones, and then there's this one here, which has a 1/4" headphone jack on the side so that you could use your own. So this smart looking little box here is really performing two functions. The first of those is as a stereo demultiplexer, but the second is as a headphone amplifier, because the volume control on the main unit doesn't affect the volume output through here. This is just receiving a line level input from the socket here, and also the power that's going into this is allowing this to act as a headphone amp, and you control the volume for your headphone output with the dial on the front of it. Now, one massive limitation to doing things this way is that whilst you can listen to your records in stereo or your cassettes in stereo through the speakers on the main unit, if you want to listen to your radio in stereo, you have to listen to it through headphones. And the one question that immediately sprung to mind was, why have they done things this way? Yeah, when you see this used in conjunction with that, it does seem a very odd way to go about doing things. However, there were other products within the Sanyo range that the Stereocast adapter was compatible with, and with some of those it seems to make a little bit more sense. So let's have a look. These scans are from Sanyo's 1973 catalogue, and quite a big deal is being made of the Stereocast adapter and the compatible range of devices. Stereocast is described as exhilarating, spacious and distortion-free, and it goes on to state that for the first time you can hear this exciting sound from even the smallest Sanyo radio. And Sanyo seem very proud of this system. It's described as a miracle of miniaturisation, the world's first high-fidelity stereo system you can hold in one hand. Now, as well as the G2615N music system that I own, this Stereocast adapter can be plugged into any of the models in their FM receiving range that also bear a Stereocast logo. And these mostly consist of a range of portable battery-powered radios in various sizes. And when you look at the smallest of these, a portable radio that can fit in a pocket that when combined with the adapter and the headphones becomes a personal stereo music player, you can't help but think that Sanyo almost had that idea for the Walkman in the early part of the 1970s. But getting back to the present day, let's open the Stereocast adapter up and take a look inside. Right, so that's the circuitry that was required at the time this was put together in the early 1970s. To split the audio out into stereo and then send it out over this stereo 1/4" socket. There's a lot of stuff going on in there. It's almost enough for a radio on its own, really. We've got a volume control on the front here, which by the way has a very pleasing feel to it, and the LED. But the rest of this, it's just listening to the audio. And I say listening, it's not really dealing with radio reception anymore at this point, because we've done all that elsewhere. All that's going in here, that's an audio signal, the same as if you plug your headphones into that, you'd hear it as FM mono.
And it's queuing in Tarleton on Liverpool Road at the Tarleton traffic lights.
And then in that one is just the power to power this device. You might have spotted earlier that the price of the Stereocast adapter was $11.95. That was US dollars in 1974, so let's just round it up to $12 for the adapter with or without the headphones. How does that relate to the overall price of a Sanyo portable transistor radio at this point? Well, the handheld FM radio that we saw before was $20. In fact, on this page, you can see a bundle of that radio with the stereo adapter at $30. So if you want FM stereo, you have to pay half as much again as you do for FM mono. And of course, then you also end up with your neat little radio having a dongle hanging off it. The amount of components in here, the size they take up combined with the cost of putting them all together, might explain why you wouldn't want to put them in a small portable transistor radio that's trying to hit a particular budget price. It doesn't, though, explain why you wouldn't want to put them in this, because there's plenty of room in here, and I'm quite sure you could fit the stereo output. The rest of it is stereo, after all. It's just the radio part that isn't, so why not just put the demodulator circuitry in here? And I've got to think it comes down to cost. When I did the video about this, I explained it really was quite a budget device. These were budget components put together to make it look like something better than they were. Well, they also made a number of these over the years, similar type devices, and I've got to think that the internals of this are perhaps from a generation earlier. They were doing these things for a couple of years before this one. Maybe this is just a kind of refresh of the design, but the circuitry, etc. inside here, it's all from a few years earlier when they weren't selling FM stereo radio sets. So rather than redo all the circuitry at great expense, just put the same old thing out you always have done and just put some sockets on the front that allow you to attach one of these. Then again, I wasn't working at Sanyo in the early 1970s, so it's all a bit of guesswork, this. But what I think we should do now is play some audio through this, through the radio as it would come out of the headphone jack, and then through this to hear the difference between the stereo decoding and the original.
On your radio, mobile, smart speaker, and ad break free on Greatest Hits Radio Premium.
Across Manchester and the Northwest.
This is Greatest Hits Radio.
Across Manchester and the Northwest.
This is Greatest Hits Radio.
This little device has made me think about FM stereo in a way that I haven't before. I've always just really taken it for granted. I've listened on and off all my life and never sat down and properly thought about it. This has changed that because FM doesn't have to be stereo. It always has been for me. When I go on the dial here, I tune, every single station comes in, a little FM stereo light comes on. Doesn't have to. You could broadcast in FM mono if you wanted, and indeed they kind of are in a way, because rather than broadcasting two separate channels, they just broadcasted the one signal that gets picked up as mono, but then your demodulator splits it out into stereo. But they send a carrier signal to say whether or not their signal that they're sending out is stereo encoded. And that carrier signal can be turned on and off. In fact, there was a story I read from a chap who was once working in a radio station in the rural US somewhere. They used to broadcast in FM mono, and the bosses told them to send the carrier signal out so that the stereo light came on, even though it wasn't in stereo, because it was more prestigious. But yeah, I've never really picked up FM mono as far as I'm aware. Of course, there is that mono and stereo button on a lot of old radios, and if you press mono, the signal clears up dramatically in a lot of cases. Change it back to stereo, you get all sorts of weird issues, interference and things, and that's why a lot of these stations were broadcasted in FM mono, and it makes a lot of sense. I've never really thought about that switch on there. What you're actually doing when it's pressed down into the mono mode, that's what it actually sounds like originally. put it into stereo, that's when you're activating your demodulation circuitry and splitting it out. So you're actually altering the signal in a way in your radio. But if we go to a radio, I've got one here, this GE one, got it recently for another video. This has, on the dial here, we've got stereo and FM. So basically FM stereo and FM mono. And just a quick demonstration of the difference in the quality that I'm getting here between the stereo and the mono on FM. Let's have a look.
To argue about the same things over and over again. And this is one of the things about families that makes me the happiest. Families hold on to grudges in a way that no one else can or will.
Now, if you're wondering why FM stereo is more prone to distortion and interference than mono, I'd really recommend doing a few searches online to read proper technical information from the experts. This is all a bit above my pay grade. However, there are a couple of bullet points that I've taken from things I've read. One source stated that FM mono only needs 15 kilohertz, whereas FM stereo needs 53 kilohertz. And this answer on Quora seems quite authoritative on the subject. It mentions that FM stereo reception picks up 4 times more noise, and enabling the stereo circuitry effectively cancels the noise reduction technology that makes FM mono sound so much better than AM. Now, over the years, I've had loads of different radios, and some of them had a mono button on them, but I've never really activated it because I always wanted to get a stereo experience. I always felt like it was degrading things, but I think nowadays I probably would have pressed it more if I was getting a signal that was getting a load of interference. It cuts it out completely in a lot of cases. And one place where that would be really handy would be on a radio in a car. I think the FM radio in a car is perhaps the most likely place I'm going to listen to it now, but I don't have a mono button on that radio. Maybe there's something buried in a menu somewhere on the touch screen, but I doubt it. But it could really do with being there, because that's the place where you're more likely to get fringe reception that you might want to get in clearly. It doesn't necessarily have to be in stereo in your car, but perhaps it's all a little bit late to sort this out now. But one thing that it got me thinking about is a modern day radio in stereo always. I mean, you can get devices such as this one here with a single speaker on, but it's got a headphone output. Is that going to be a stereo headphone output? I mean, I'd imagine they're all using a similar chipset, and I'd imagine that chipset's going to be a stereo chipset. So is a radio with one speaker on it, is this a stereo radio in disguise, or is it something else? Well, there's only really one way to find out, so let's have a look. Now, this is a lovely little radio. It's a new one. I only got it a couple of years ago. They're selling these currently, at least I think they are still. It's the ICF 506. Of course, it's from Sony. Telescopic antenna on the top. We've got a fold-up handle there, which has a pleasing feel to it. Everything's rounded off, as you can see at the edges, so it's a very tactile object. Lovely large speaker on the front here. Gives a nice clear sound. AM and FM switch at the bottom, which also turns it on. We've got the light there to show the operation, and I've got a tuning light for FM. The tuning dial is on the side here, or the control for it, and the volume there. These have got a pleasant feel to them as well. Really nicely dampened and smooth operation. Headphone output there, and that's about it. It just takes some batteries, of course, in the back.
Diagnosis wedi treblu dros y tair blynedd ddiwetha.
You might be able to tell from that it's got a good tone to it. So yeah, simple little thing, but I never really thought about this because I've never plugged headphones into it, but I didn't realise the whole thing is, of course, entirely mono.
Across Manchester and the North West.
This is Greatest Hits Radio.
Now, you might be wondering, if I could supply the power to the Stereocast, would it also be able to produce stereo from Sony's mono headphone socket? I certainly was, and the answer to that question, though, is a resounding no. People way smarter than myself explain that a regular headphone socket won't output all the frequencies that the Stereocast needs. The ultrasonics and the 19 kHz stereo pilot tone, those will have all been stripped out. It's especially important to remove that pilot tone, as it would be irritating to the people who are capable of hearing it. So yeah, the Stereocast needs a special output, one that carries the full range of audio rather than what you get from a regular headphone socket.
Done so many things that it didn't have. It was a danger to be sitting in it.
But here's something to bear in mind. Now that we know that a newly manufactured Sony radio with a single speaker on the front outputs in mono over the headphone socket, that might be something you'd assume is going to be carried through the range. However, if you were to get hold of one of these, again, a Sony radio with a single speaker on the front, this one outputs in stereo.
Across Manchester and the North West.
Greatest Hits Radio.
The good times.
Sound like this.
Greatest Hits Radio.
A little bit more sophisticated as these devices go. This has an FM and a DAB radio. We've got preset buttons on the top here as well. It's a lovely little device, this one. The model number is the XDR S41D. The sound isn't quite as good though due to the smaller size of speaker, but still a very pleasant little radio. But yeah, there's no legends, there's no information printed on this to say headphone output in stereo. But then again, there was no information on this one to say headphone output in mono. I suppose it's just something you have to test for yourself, unless you go looking through the specs page, but I'm quite sure they probably won't even mention that. So maybe it's just something you'd have to try out when you get hold of one. You might find that you've got some stereo radios that you thought were mono, and some mono ones that you thought were stereo. Now, I thought it was quite interesting that 50 years ago, if you wanted to get stereo FM out of your Sanyo portable music devices, well, you had to go and invest some money in an additional adapter. Nowadays, if you got an FM radio, you'd pretty much assume that it's going to output in FM stereo, and yet they don't all do that. However, if you got a little DAB radio like this that does output in stereo on both FM and DAB, you can then find that quite a few of the DAB radio stations here in the UK are actually broadcasting in mono to save on bandwidth. And another thing that you could argue hasn't changed very much over that 50 years, if you wanted to get stereo music out of a modern smartphone like this over your own wired headphones, well, you have to invest in a little silly dongle like this. Yeah, infuriating. But for some reason, they couldn't fit that inside there. There's just no room. Yeah, all right then. Well, spare a thought for these people who bought this thing. For some reason, they couldn't fit this thing inside there. So yeah, it's deja vu all over again. Anyway, that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.